The idea is if the US cuts off all advanced GPU sales to China, Chinese companies that are developing AI turn to domestic alternatives. And the US will lose that market and also push those companies and those hardware developers in China to get better. And then they'll compete outside of China with NVIDIA and the US AI stack. So the idea is to keep Chinese developers using some version of the AI stack. The argument against holds that this is going to give China and Chinese companies a huge advantage to defeat the US in AI.
What is NVIDIA's H200 GPU chip, and why was it previously not allowed to be sold to China?
The H stands for Hopper, so that's an architecture that NVIDIA rolled out in 2024. At the time, it was never actually legally cleared for export to China. It was at the middle of the U.S. China tech competition. In 2022, for the first time ever, the U.S. government began controlling exports of things like GPUs to China. There has always been some control sales of advanced compute to China. So, for example, the U.S. government has never allowed the sale of supercomputers to China. It wasn't really until the advent of some of these really, really capable GPUs that could be strung together into something like a supercomputer that the issue of controlling also the GPUs became important. Now, the US government had also controlled the export of the intellectual property, for example, around CPUs, the central processing units, for a long time. Intel, for example, developed the x86 architecture for its CPUs, many of which I'm sure you and others still use in your PCs, your desktop PCs. So the US government didn't prevent the export of those CPUs to China, but it did prevent the export of the intellectual property that would allow China to build those on its own. But GPUs now come into the picture in 2020, 2021. This also coincides with the dawn of the age of AI, with the advent of things like ChatGPT in 2022 and generative AI sort of becoming on the scene, that consciousness of AI grew, and also of the power of AI, and that eventually AI would prove to be a game-changing technology, both economically and potentially militarily. At that time, a lot of GPUs were already being used as accelerators for high-performance computing. If you string together tens of thousands of these GPUs, you essentially have a supercomputer that can be used to train a big AI model or can be used to run the applications that that model is supporting. And so in 2022, big deal, controlling GPU exports and controlling semiconductor tools that are used to make the semiconductors. Those two sets of controls were huge. And then they were updated in October 2023 and then updated again in December of 2024, just as the Biden administration was leaving office.
How has changing US policy affected which chips can be sold to China?
Between 2022 and 2023, the H100, which was the predecessor of the H200, was allowed for shipment to China. But then in 2023, the US government changed the performance parameters around these GPUs, and that caught the H100. So since about 2023, the only thing that had been available to sell to China was a degraded version of several GPUs, including the so-called H20, which is really a degraded version of the H200. The US government came out with a threshold for performance for these chips, and then NVIDIA and then AMD designed right up to that threshold. But to do that, they had to degrade the performance of GPUs. And the reason that was important was because nobody else would buy the degraded GPUs. NVIDIA built so many of these GPUs over the last 2 years, and then the US changed its mind earlier in the year. The Trump administration decided not to allow the H20s for a brief period. And then NVIDIA was sitting on all these chips they couldn't sell to the tune of something like $5 billion. So this process of back and forth was damaging NVIDIA financially because they had to redesign the chip. They had to produce it in Taiwan, and then they really didn't know what the demand was.
What factors caused US policy on exporting GPU chips to change?
As we got into the Trump administration, the big difference was that the Trump administration brought in people from industry, people who really understood the technology. President Trump, by this time, had a lot of friends in Silicon Valley and was surrounding himself with tech bros. And so the arguments that the industry had been making that maybe doing these controls there were some downsides to these, for example. So they were, as I noted, damaging NVIDIA in terms of sales. They were also damaging US toolmakers. By pulling out of China, the Chinese toolmakers got better, and the Japanese and the Dutch are still in China. So all these controls were being re-examined in a new light. And then the president also became very enamored of Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. And so over the last 4 to 6 months, there's been this debate about should some of these controls be modified? Because what happened, of course, over time is the Chinese government was like, wow, we don't want to have our companies buy inferior GPUs. We don't like that. And so this year, for the first time, the Chinese government was pushing back on the sales of these degraded GPUs. So anyway, so the H200 is a non-degraded GPU that was previously not allowed to be sold to China and now is.
What are the economic implications of selling H200 chips to China?
Chinese companies are likely going to buy millions of these GPUs, but it's not the most cutting edge GPU the US has. NVIDIA has the new architecture Blackwell and is already way ahead on the next two iterations of its hardware architecture. And so the argument is this isn't the most cutting edge GPU that the US has. So let's keep China able to buy some of these advanced GPUs so that their developers are developing on US hardware stacks to develop their AI models so that NVIDIA and the US in general doesn't lose the entire market in China to domestic companies. So that's the significance. It means that the Chinese companies, at least for the near term, will be able to purchase this GPU, train some of their models on it. Many people were critical of this, but the view of industry and the view of Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, and David Sachs, who's the White House AI czar, they both supported this idea that the US government shouldn't be making it difficult for a company like NVIDIA to continue to have market share in China. So this is, at one level, putting NVIDIA back in the game of supplying to the Chinese market.
How does this policy decision differ from the previous administration's policy?
The key thing to note is in 2022, Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor at the time, he made the argument that the U.S. should maintain an absolute lead over China in this compute realm. That means the U.S. should keep China basically at the same level. And that was sort of the goal of the controls, was to slow China so that it couldn't really innovate very fast and keep the U.S. at an absolute level. Now, the president said the U.S. is now back in a sliding scale. So H200s are not the most advanced, but they're pretty good, right? They're the previous generation. So the US will now allow China to have this technology and won't try to sort of freeze their technology development. And of course, Chinese companies have found many ways around some of the controls too. And that was one of the worries, was they would get better at that, and then they would sort of essentially freeze the US out of the China market. So all those arguments came together to change the rethinking of the controls. And that's an ongoing process. So probably next year, for example, we'll get some effort by the industry to say, you should also rethink, for example, the controls on the tools. Because here the argument would be that, hey, the H200 is made in Taiwan at the so-called 5 nanometer process node, which is a very advanced node. And the US controls are targeted at China on the 14 nanometer node, which is now not very advanced. And so the argument will be made, if you're having a sliding scale and you can ship these GPUs that are not the most advanced, because we're going to protect the most advanced, but the technology is at this level, and you're controlling the tools at a much more high level, that scale should slide also. So probably next year we'll have also potentially a reconsideration of the tooling part of this, because again, US companies are very competitive in that space, and they've been damaged financially, and that also translates into their ability to do R&D and to continue to innovate. So the controls are under some review, and the effectiveness of them is being debated. Did they work? And all of that depends on what your view of China and the industry is.
What are the national security implications of selling advanced compute like NVIDIA's H200 chips to China?
Compute in general is a sensitive topic because advanced computing can be used for many, many things, right? It can be used to design drugs to help with healthcare, but it can also be used to design weapons and weapon systems. That's always been the case. The key thing is AI is being viewed a little bit differently, because AI itself is a very advanced technology that some believe will be really critical determinant of economic and national security in the future. Now, that partially rests on the idea that whoever gets to some really advanced level of AI, usually called artificial general intelligence, and then artificial superintelligence, whichever country gets there first will win. That's a very, very, very questionable argument, because the timeline is uncertain. When do we get to AGI or ASI? And can we get there with existing technology? And so the thinking there goes is whoever gets there first will have a so-called decisive strategic advantage over the other countries that don't get there first. And then that gap in terms of keeping the second best country from getting there should be as big as possible. Therefore, let's slow down China and China's ability to keep developing advanced AI. So the national security argument there is almost beyond a simple military argument. So the justifications for the export controls have all been predicated on this idea of civil mill fusion in China, so-called Junmin Ronghe, which means that the civilian sector does to some degree support the military in terms of technology advances. Now, the Chinese would argue this is exactly what the US does, of course, too, right? The US government, for example, works with Boeing to develop aircraft, military aircraft. And in fact, the US leading model makers, for example, OpenAI and Anthropic, are working with the US government on AI applications. So from the Chinese government point of view, this is just how technology develops. Some technology is going to be used by the government for military or intelligence purposes. But the bigger argument around national security here on AI is that AI is special and it's a special technology, and that whoever gets to a most advanced level of AI will have a much bigger advantage in terms of national security. Now, I've argued against that way of thinking because it's complicated. There's no clear timeline for getting to this advanced level of technology. It could be 2 years, but it could be 10 years. And then the other issue is it's very unclear how that capability, once reached, would be used. There seems to be a sort of almost simplistic view, I would call it, that whoever got there first would somehow use it right away to suppress the other country. But in my view, none of the other applications militarily is going to be decisive. Already AI is being used just as an augmentation of sort of normal software that's used in the warfighting domain. And so AI is going to continue to do that. It will provide some benefits for cyber operations as another national security problem. But to me, it's not really that decisive. It's just a natural extension of technology competition. And now AI is part of that. But the bigger argument is that risk of whoever getting to advanced intelligence is going to have an advantage, and then what would they do with it? And that's a legitimate topic to discuss, but I think so far my view is the discussions around how governments, for example, and very sophisticated governments like those of the US and China would react to the development of that capability are so far lacking, and they tend to devolve into things like if China got there first, they would take down US critical infrastructure, which I really don't think would be the case, the first thing the Chinese government would think of.
How should the US China tech and AI competition be viewed?
A lot of arms race analogies. The problem is for weapon systems like missiles and nuclear weapons, there have been races before, right, between countries to get to their first. But those technologies are very specific to military use. So the big difference is the vast majority of the use cases for AI are not military, right? They're drug discovery, they're helping with healthcare, radiology, reading tumors, developing new ways to combat climate change. So AI has this huge range of application, of which military is really a very small one right now. Whereas most other traditional military technologies that are out there, they're pretty narrowly used. Missile technology can be used for space launch. Most of the technologies involved in nuclear weapons development are only really used for weapons development. So AI is a very different technology, in other words, than some of the previous technologies that the US government has tried to control through export controls, which were really directed at weapons of mass destruction. So things like nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. That's the challenge here. In this case, the US government is using these tools really of the Cold War and of the era of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to try to go after a technology that is by its very nature very different and is a general purpose technology that everybody wants and everybody is using primarily for economic development and for solving really complicated problems that humanity faces. In my view, we shouldn't be national securitizing this technology fully, because from the point of view of the Chinese government, it looks like the US is trying to contain China rather than focus on national security. That's the challenge of this, is AI is different, and people can make arguments around national security that, in my view, don't hold up to close scrutiny. The issue of AI is now spoken almost always in terms of economic security and national security, and then oftentimes they're conflated, and so economic security is national security. So in addition, for example, to the military implications existentially of whoever gets there first, the idea is companies in both US and China are competing, and our companies need to have better AI to outcompete Chinese companies, right? Because that's an economic security issue. So those issues are now part of the discussion too.